I want to talk to you today about interrogating injustice. Interrogating injustice. So what does that mean? So first, the word interrogating I use decidedly because I am a lawyer. So I teach, I write, I do scholarship, but I still am a lawyer. I still engage in the courtroom. And one of the things we do in courtrooms is interrogate witnesses. Right? So there are various ages out here. You know, some of you will remember the old Perry Mason show. All right? He was this great lawyer who could make any and everybody confess. Right? You understand? Yes, I did it. I'm sorry. And then the case would be over. But he did this through what we call cross-examination. That is, he interrogated people. Perry Mason didn't just stand up and people broke down. I did it. No, he would ask them a series of questions, interrogate them to the point where they decided to be honest and truthful and admit to the crime, and the person wrongfully on trial would be vindicated. So I've spent much of my professional career in an effort to interrogate injustice. And let's see what that means. I want to tell you a couple stories because I find that stories are really useful in getting a real sense of what's going on out there. So before the first story, I'll pick up on something that Dave Thomas said. So in terms of the wrongfully convicted and wrongfully incarcerated people, my team and I have gotten released over 6,000 people across the country in the last 10, 20 years. One guess what just about all 6,000 of them looked like. You only get one guess. What do you think? Yeah, they're black, mostly black and brown people. Overwhelming majority of those 6,000 wrongfully incarcerated or wrongfully convicted. That's more than a sort of statistical error, right? Something is going on there, so we have to drill down and figure out why that is. I want to tell you about a man named Robert Hill who wrote my office a few years ago. He had been in jail for over 25 years, and he asked me to take a look at his case. The case seemed open and shut. He had been in jail for 25 some odd years. There was an eyewitness who said she knew Robert Hill, knew him from the neighborhood, and she witnessed the killing, right? She witnessed the killing. So he was tried, convicted, sentenced. All of his appeals were expired, and he wrote and said, look, I did not do this. Can you help me? So we took a look at this case. Why? We took a look at this case because it was a single witness ID case. Why does that matter? In my academic work, I had taken a look at every DNA exoneration in the country. And I wanted to see why in the world were all these people convicted. And I looked at the factors in those cases that came up most often. My hypothesis was that if you saw it in DNA cases, then you would see the same sort of error in non-DNA cases, and probably greater because the lawyering isn't as good, the resources weren't as good, and so forth. So the thing that came up first were single witness identification cases. Those were the cases that were most prone to error out of any other sorts of cases. And if you drill down a little bit more, cross-racial identification, single witness cases, were even more prone to error. But single witness identification cases, why? Well, the literature tells us that we think our memory is like a video camera. It's not. Our memories are highly contingent. You know, I will sometimes tell people, describe yourself at a dinner party you were at a week ago. And in your own mind's eye, you can see yourself and what you're wearing and what you're saying, your facial expressions. You can imagine all of this. But unless you're like standing in front of a mirror, you're not seeing that at all. You're imagining that, right? Memory is highly contingent. And now you add in a startling event, guns waving around. Memory is not as good as we think it is, but it's powerful in court, right? Madam, did you see who shot the sheriff? I did. Where is that person? Right there, right? It's powerful in court. It's a powerful thing. Not as accurate as we think it is. So because this was a single witness identification case, we decided to take a look at it because those cases are prone to error. I'm not going to talk too long about this. We started digging. We looked at the single witness identification, and I recognized the name. This was a project I was working on in New York. I recognized the name because I had seen that name before. It turned out that this single witness, eyewitness, was a witness that a now disgraced New York detective had used in 6 other homicides around the city. She was a drug-addicted sex worker who he used to say, I saw this and I saw that. So 6 people, right? Now this is a case where big data would have been actually useful in the criminal justice system, right? To be able to spit that name out and at least let someone say, so how does this person witness 6 separate murders, different parts of Brooklyn, different sets, different groups of people? How does this happen? You know, it's almost like, again, I'm showing my age with these references, but it almost made me think of that old show, Murder, She Wrote. You guys remember that? Right? So the character was a novelist. The main character was a novelist. Everywhere she went, somebody died. You know, she would be the worst traveling companion ever, right? You go to a cruise, somebody's dead. Bridge parties, somebody's dead. I mean, and so I'm looking at this and I'm saying, how can she just happen to be around all of these murders? And it turns out she wasn't. This detective wanted to close a bunch of cases. Look him up if you want. Louis Scarcella was his name in New York. He's now under investigation. But we did the rest of the work and figured out that he didn't do it. After 27 years, he walked out of prison, a free man, and missed a lot. Missed 27 years, missed a lot of life. I'll tell you a second story. This is a guy named Roger Logan. Mr. Logan was an individual who, again, single witness identification case. And here it is. The eyewitness said, I saw Mr. Logan getting into an argument with some guys over a dice game, right? They argued, they yelled, they screamed at each other, and then the next day, I saw Mr. Logan chase after these guys, kick in a door, start shooting, and someone ended up dead, right? He was arrested, tried, convicted, and 17 years later, he said essentially the same thing. I was framed, can you help me? All appeals had expired and so forth. Because of this triage that we were able to develop, you know, it didn't mean this guy was innocent, but we said, wait, let's just look at it. Single witness identification case. 90% of them turned out it was a correct conviction. 90% plus, I mean, the vast majority correct conviction, but we need to take another look at it. So what we did was went to the scene, first of all. The eyewitness said that, the night in question I was outside, I saw him kick in the door and start shooting, and then I ran to my apartment right next door, looked out the window, and he was still shooting. So far consistent. It was about 10 or 15 shots. It was possible. Sent the investigators to the scene, and a couple things jumped out at me. One, well, why had nobody visited the scene yet, but let's put that aside for a second. So while she lived next door, she didn't live right next door, right? I mean, there was a little distance between where it happened. And while her apartment did look out on the vestibule where the shooting was, her apartment was on the second floor. So she would have had to run into the building, up to the second floor, look out the window. We got into that apartment, looked out the window. You could see it kind of, but wasn't a great view. Then we had some guys time it, let's run from the place of the shooting to the apartment building. So these two middle-aged white guys stood in this neighborhood, very out of place, and one held up his hand and said, bang, 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 while he was holding a stopwatch. And of course, it turns out that Usain Bolt could not have made that run in the time that this witness claimed that she had made the run. So we started looking a little deeper into the witness, and it turned out that the witness was in police custody at the time that she claimed that Mr. Logan was engaged in this misbehavior. And nobody saw it. Nobody saw it. She could not have been where she said she was because she was in jail. And this man spent 17 years of his life in jail. So, injustice is a thing that we see. And race tends to be at the center. Race insinuates itself into almost every aspect of our lives, and it negatively affects people in ways large and small. So I'm going to talk to you about the ways in which my work has taught me about race and what are the larger lessons that we can learn from it, the ways in which race works in the country. So in terms of bad things happening, so I talked to you about two people, Robert Hill, Roger Logan. Injustice, by any definition, right? No innocent person should be in jail for a day, let alone 27 years. And just stop there. Can you imagine? Every day for 27 years, you knew that you didn't belong in this place, but you were stuck there. Appeal after appeal denied. 27 years. By any definition, that is injustice. So, what do we do about it? The notion here, all right, I've knocked it down like 5 times. The notion here is that injustice doesn't remedy itself. Injustice doesn't magically disappear. Injustice doesn't go away as a function of wishful thinking. Injustice is here in ways that are stark, like 27 years, and in ways that may not be as stark. First point, we all participate in injustice. Each and every one of us participate in injustice, mostly by way of omission, and I hope nobody in this room is actively committing a crime or an injustice, but most of us by way of omission, right? So what do I mean by that? And I won't point the finger at anyone else. I'll just point the finger, this way. So I consider myself, for example, pro-environment, and I think that there are issues with respect to the way we handle our environment, the way we pollute, and so forth. But if you look out in that parking lot, when I leave, I'm going to hop into an SUV. That's real. There's an inconsistency there, and it's something that I have to own, right? All right. I certainly don't consider myself a sexist, right? But I sit on a faculty that is still predominantly male. I didn't do what Derek Bell did. Get up, leave, do the teach in, all right? We all participate in forms of injustice, even sometimes when we don't consider ourselves to be active participants. But injustice doesn't remedy itself. Martin Luther King once famously said that time is not a neutral concept. Time can be used constructively or time can be used destructively. He then went on to say people who use time destructively are often much more effective than people who use time constructively. So the old adage, time heals all wounds, is actually gibberish and nonsense, right? You cut yourself seriously and just wait, right? Time's not going to heal that wound, right? You need to go to a doctor, right? Time plus medicine, right? Or the body's own internal medicine, right? White blood cells, right? Time in and of itself isn't going to do anything. People have to do it. And since I just mentioned King and the president of Morehouse College is here, I've got to say just a little bit more about Martin Luther King, who was a Morehouse man, in case people didn't know. King also, when King was at Morehouse, he was fascinated by German idealist philosophers. And one such philosopher got him thinking about what this philosopher called the Zeitgeist. And Zeitgeist is one of those famous, lovely German idealist philosopher words that they just made up, but it means like this world spirit that moves, that moves things. So King's notion was that if the country gets caught up in this world spirit, then things would be better. Things would get better. And from this, King said, and many of you have heard this, that the arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice. The arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice. I actually don't think that was 100% correct. And King's actions actually belied this notion. The arc of history is long, but it doesn't just bend toward justice. People bend it toward justice, right? Things just didn't change during King's era in the civil rights movement. No, it was marching and sit-ins. This arc just didn't bend by itself. They forced this arc to bend. So the arc of history is long, but you and I have to bend it toward justice. So when we see or perceive an injustice in the school, in the workplace, in society, time isn't going to do anything by itself. We, people, have to do something. So in this sense, I argue often that justice doesn't just happen. People have to do justice. People have to make justice happen. Now, doing justice often is difficult for us, largely because we are completely blinded, knowingly or unknowingly, by the Western philosophic tradition. And in this tradition, we are conditioned to think of justice as something that's unattainable. So our concepts of justice derive from Plato. And Plato's magnificent project attempted to fuse the public and the private in such a way where he was able to articulate a reason for us to be good, a reason for us to be just. And Plato taught us that justice is this concept that existed as a pristine ideal somewhere, someplace, but that justice on the ground did not exist, that all of this we see in front of us wasn't real, but real concepts like justice were in an area that was somewhere unattainable, right? And that's this. Some of you may remember the whole cave allegory that Plato did. That was Plato said all this stuff is shadows, but things like justice, that's real, right? So, in Plato's view, I suppose that we die and go somewhere and bump into triangles and shake hands with justice, but it's not here, right? And this notion has sort of trickled down. And we think that justice is this thing that exists somewhere and it's going to happen. But justice, I would suggest to each and every one of us, is a very real, tangible, pragmatic concept that people, women and men, can make happen if they choose to make it happen. So this is where Plato misses the mark. Justice is not a rarefied abstraction. Justice means that we do, that we act, that we remain ever vigilant in ensuring that the reach of the rights that each and every one of us has in this room extends to the several people outside of this room. And that's hard to grapple with. That's a very hard concept to grapple with. So what I want to suggest is that we have an obligation in our professional lives, in our personal lives, to actually do justice, to actually make justice happen. And when we do justice, we can work to convert a legal landscape that serves the interests of a few into something more fair and beautiful that serves the interests of the many. When we do justice, this is a tricky one at the business school. When we do justice, we cannot let the anesthetizing security of a good job and a big paycheck lull us into a vapid do-nothingness. We have to act, do. Justice isn't going to happen all by itself. When we see these statistics, when we see in my field black men locked up at an alarming rate, we have to do something. When we do justice, that means ensuring that we lend a helping hand to those who need it most, that the same rules apply to all people. So I work in addition to the appointment at the law school, I'm faculty dean of one of the houses at the college, right? So I am very active in undergraduate life here. And I can tell you that 19-year-olds at Harvard College are doing many of the same things that 19-year-olds are doing right down 2 miles away in Roxbury. How are they dealt with? How are they dealt with? On the one hand, at Harvard College, it's an educational issue. If there is let's assume that there may be a violation of law at the college, underage drinking or use of a substance that the law prescribes. Let's assume that happens, right? Are my students getting arrested? No. It's an educational issue, right? Are same age kids 2 miles away getting arrested? Yes. A record, employment problems, other collateral consequences like not being able to get a Pell Grant to go to college. Shouldn't it be a regime where we treat similarly situated people the same, right? We're seeing this work itself out in the opioid epidemic, right? So a friend and a terrific scholar named Bill Stuntz, who passed away from cancer far too early, argued that if we want to fix criminal law, we have to localize decision-making in criminal law. Localize it. What did he mean by that? So he said that, well, when legislators make legislation and enact legislation that has penalties that do not affect them, their children, or people they know, it's very easy to do mandatory minimums and 10, 15-year minimums. Very easy, right? Because it's abstract. It's impacting and affecting someone else, right? Stunt said, let's localize this, right? Because it's the people who are impacted by these laws. They should have a real voice in determining what the penalties are, right? And we're seeing this in the opioid crisis and the heroin crisis. When opioid addiction impacts communities who have wealth and privilege in this country, then the conversation changes from a criminal conversation to a medicinal vocabulary, which is how it should be. But it should be for both sides, right? Crack cocaine versus powder cocaine. You guys may not know this story, but we're right here in Boston. So Len Bias, he was drafted by the Celtics. And the projection was that this draft pick, he would come in and, with Bird and those guys, and that would just be a whole nother Celtics era. And he died, as many of you know, from a drug overdose. All right. Tip O'Neill thought that it was crack cocaine. Why? Well, because, of course, all black people use crack cocaine. But by that time, Bias had his signing bonus. He had powder cocaine, right? But this is how we got the crack cocaine disparity, because a Boston legislator got really mad and said, we've got to do something about this, right? But the draconian penalties never impacted or affected that community. When we talk about heroin addiction now and opioid addiction now, it impacts a number of communities, and we're using a different language. So here's what we might want to think about in terms of a notion of localizing the law or regulation, is to begin to think of other and different people more as we instead of they. More as we instead of they. We never would have gotten into this crack cocaine versus powder cocaine dichotomy. We never would have gotten the Rockefeller drug laws that put people in jail who have very, very, very minor roles in a drug sale in jail for life. We never would have done that because it just didn't affect that community. So the notion of doing justice means that we have to refuse to let inadequate resources be a proxy for the type of justice that one receives. I mean, we see this all the time now, that color becomes a proxy for the form of justice that we receive. And that cannot be, and it must not be, but it will continue to happen unless and until people of goodwill decide that they are going to do justice and make justice happen. I had lunch just a week ago with a woman who was very recently retiring from one of the largest VC firms in the country. And she's over here doing a program at Harvard that I'm associated with, and I asked her. I said, "So how many black people do you have at the firm that you just left?" And the answer was, "Well, we've been trying really hard to," and then so you know what's about. So I didn't get a number, but I got an explanation, right? And we ultimately got to a number. And this is no dig on this individual, because this individual is actively attempting to make inroads for both women and people of color. But it is to say that injustice in the form of non-diverse settings doesn't just happen either. So at Winthrop House, where I'm faculty dean, you look at our numbers in diversity. So we hire tutors. These are graduate students who come in and live in the house, and they take part in the house life, and they get free room and board. It's a very for a graduate student, it's a very good program. It's very non-diverse. Right? There are these assistant deans called resident deans. The whole cadre is non-diverse, right? You look at Winthrop's numbers over my 8 years as faculty dean, we've got the most diverse staff at the college, by far. And people say, how do you do it? How do you do it? Well, I'll tell you how I don't do it, right? I don't sit down and wait for somebody to come, "Hey, I'm a diverse candidate." Right? No, you got to go out and look. You've got to go out and find. We didn't get a good, solid, diverse pool for our assistant dean. So what did we do? We made some telephone calls. Do you know any recent PhDs, newly minted PhDs, who want to go into administration? And, then we start getting people in. The point is, you have to do it. You have to make justice happen, because justice in and of itself will not just happen. So if we are committed to doing justice, we have to refuse to allow the law itself to conspire in ways to maintain the sort of unequal distribution of burdens and benefits in the society that has existed for all these many years. And sometimes that's difficult because, with respect to people of resources, this unequal distribution, it works pretty darn well for your pocketbook, right? For my pocketbook. But in the long run, it's not going to work that well for children, grandchildren, definitely not your cousins. We have the ability to make a society that's more fair and more just. It takes the will, it takes an affirmative will of good people to go out there and do justice.